The first thing I noticed was the sound. Footsteps on wood that didn't hesitate. I was standing on my dock at sunrise, coffee steaming in my hand, watching the fog lift off Willow Bend Lake, when three people in matching HOA polos walked straight across the planks like the water beneath them already belonged to them. The woman in front didn't say hello. She didn't slow down. She stopped inches from me, pressed a folded notice flat against my chest and said, "You have 48 hours to remove this structure, or the association will move to seize it." The paper was still warm from her hand. That was the moment it became clear this wasn't about safety. It wasn't about noise. It wasn't about aesthetics. This was about power. My name is Caleb Rowan, and that dock was not some weekend hobby. I built it with my father, board by board, long before an HOA ever existed here. Every plank had a purpose. Every bolt had a reason. On damp mornings, the cedar still carried the same smell it did the day we finished it. Marilyn Keene, the HOA president, didn't ask about any of that. She smiled, glanced down the dock, and spoke like the ending was already written. She told me the HOA now controlled all shoreline activity and that my dock violated community lake standards. She said it calmly, like gravity, like no one would dare question it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the lake wasn't scenery to my family. It was infrastructure. And legally, it answered to me. I let them walk away confident. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't arguing. It's letting someone think they've already won. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My family didn't stumble onto Willow Bend Lake. We were here before it had a name anyone bothered to print on a sign. My grandfather bought the land when the road into town was still dirt and the shoreline flooded every spring. Back then, the lake wasn't decorative. It was a working system, widened and reinforced after a bad flood nearly wiped out the valley. The county didn't have the money or manpower to manage it, so they leaned on people who live with it every day. That's how my family became part of the lake's rhythm. When I was a kid, I watched my father walk the shoreline with a clipboard tucked under his arm, boots sinking into wet earth. He checked the spillway after heavy rain, adjusted the inlet gates when the creek swelled, and kept handwritten logs in a notebook so worn the spine had split. He never talked about authority. He talked about balance. Too much water and fields flooded downstream. Too little and the banks cracked. The lake behaved because someone paid attention. The dock came years later. By then, I was old enough to help. We built it slowly, measuring twice, cutting once, following the same county guidelines my father had worked under for decades. Inspectors came out, nodded, signed off, and left. For years, that was the end of it. Neighbors tied their boats there. Kids jumped off it every summer. People trusted it without thinking about why. Then Cedar Ridge Estates arrived. First came survey stakes on the far side of the water. Then machinery. Then paved roads and identical mailboxes. Finally, glossy signs promising exclusive lake living. The HOA followed soon after, complete with newsletters and rules written in language that sounded official enough to discourage questions. That's when the tone around the lake changed. Marilyn Keene moved in and positioned herself as the guardian of property values. She spoke confidently at meetings using phrases like uniform standards and community protection. She talked about the lake as if it were a feature installed for the neighborhood, not a system that had existed for generations. Most residents didn't know the difference. They trusted her because she sounded certain. Slowly, the story got rewritten. HOA emails began referring to the lake as a shared amenity under association oversight. Flyers mentioned regulated shoreline use. None of it was technically true, but it sounded close enough to pass if no one pushed back. I stayed quiet, assuming it would never reach me. I didn't live inside their development. I wasn't part of their HOA. I was wrong. The first letter arrived in a thick envelope with bold warnings printed across the top. It claimed my dock violated newly adopted HOA guidelines and needed review. I set it aside. The second letter included a fine written in clipped, aggressive language meant to intimidate. The third mentioned liens casually, like foreclosure was just another step in a routine process. That one made my jaw tighten. I called the HOA office. Marilyn answered herself. Her voice was polite but sharp, every sentence edged with authority. She told me the association had expanded its oversight to include shoreline structures for safety reasons. When I mentioned county permits, she dismissed them as outdated. When I pointed out I wasn't part of the HOA, she laughed lightly and said, "The lake connects us all now." Soon after, emails went out warning residents about unsafe private docks. My dock wasn't named, but the photo made it obvious. It was taken from a low angle, shadows stretched just right to make straight boards look uneven. People who had stood on that dock for years suddenly looked at it like it might collapse under them. I gathered everything: permits, inspection records, old photos showing the dock under construction, footings visible before the water rose. I requested a meeting and laid the documents out neatly on Marilyn's desk. She didn't touch them. She leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "Community authority supersedes county approvals." No argument, no explanation. Just a declaration. A few days later, she brought in Derek Sloan. She introduced him as the HOA's preferred contractor, a structural specialist. Derek walked the dock slowly, tapping boards with his boot, scribbling notes on a clipboard. He shook his head at the right moments, used technical words without explaining them, and paused near the ladder joint longer than necessary. When he finished, he looked at Marilyn, then at me, and said, "In my professional opinion, this dock is structurally non-compliant." Marilyn nodded like she'd been waiting for that exact sentence. That was when I understood what was happening. This wasn't about inspections. It wasn't about safety. It was about setting the stage for something much bigger. The flyers showed up before the sun burned the fog off the water. I stepped outside and nearly missed it at first. A thick, glossy sheet folded neatly against my door, held in place with a small stone like it was an official notice that couldn't be ignored. Across the top, in bold letters, it warned about UNSAFE private docks and the risks they pose to families and property values. No address. No name, just a grainy photo in the center. My dock. The angle was deliberate. Shot low, shadows stretched just enough to make straight boards look uneven, the ladder joint cropped tight like it was already failing. By the time I finished reading it, my phone started buzzing. The HOA email blast followed within hours. The language was careful and sharp at the same time. Words like reckless, liability, and immediate danger were sprinkled through every paragraph. It talked about injuries, lawsuits, and how one irresponsible structure could put the entire community at risk. It never mentioned permits. It never mentioned inspections. It just repeated the word unsafe until it felt true. The hardest part wasn't the paper or the emails. It was the people. Neighbors who used to wave from their docks suddenly looked away. A couple who had tied their boat to mine every summer crossed the street when they saw me. Someone I'd known for years pretended to be busy checking their phone. Fear had moved through the neighborhood faster than facts ever could. I told myself to stay calm. To do this the right way. I gathered everything again. County permits, inspection reports, photos from the year we built the dock, the footings still exposed before the water rose. I even pulled out old pictures of my father standing there with a tape measure, smiling like he always did when something was built solid. I stacked it all neatly and requested another meeting. Marilyn Keene didn't even glance down. She listened with her fingers interlaced, nodding just enough to look patient. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Those approvals are outdated. Community authority supersedes county paperwork. I asked her how an HOA could override permits issued long before the association even existed. She smiled, thin and tight, and said, "The lake connects us all now," like that sentence carried legal weight. I walked out knowing logic wasn't going to stop this. 2 mornings later, I noticed something off. At first, it was easy to miss. A slight change in how the boards near the ladder sat. A shadow where there hadn't been one before. I crouched down and ran my hand along the joint. My fingers caught on a rough edge. Fresh wood. Pale beneath the weathered surface, I leaned closer. The split wasn't natural. It wasn't rot. It wasn't age. Someone had forced the joist apart just enough to weaken it without snapping it outright. Clean, controlled. The kind of damage that wouldn't draw attention until someone wanted it to fail. My stomach dropped. This wasn't an inspection tactic anymore. This was preparation. I stood there listening to the soft slap of water against the posts, thinking about how easily this could be discovered during an HOA inspection, how quickly an emergency shutdown could be justified, how neatly it would fit the story Marilyn had already told everyone. That afternoon, I drove into town. I spent hours installing security cameras, drilling into cedar as the smell of fresh wood shavings mixed with the humid lake air. I mounted one camera high in the trees, angled down toward the dock, and another along the narrow access path from the road. No signs, no warnings. Just hidden eyes watching the dark. Just after midnight, my phone buzzed. The motion alert pulled me out of a shallow sleep. I opened the feed and felt my chest tighten. 2 figures were moving quietly along the path, staying close to the shadows. One knelt near the ladder joint, blocking the moonlight with his body. The other stood watch, head turning every few seconds. Then I saw the tool. The kneeling figure slid a long pry bar from under his jacket. Dark metal. Taped grip. He eased it into the weakened joint slowly, carefully, leaning his weight just enough to widen the gap without making the wood crack loudly. No hammering, no sudden force. Just pressure, controlled and deliberate. The joist flexed. He pulled the bar free, wiped it once against his pant leg, and stepped back to take photos from multiple angles. That's when the camera caught his face clearly as he shifted his stance. It was Derek Sloan. He wasn't inspecting anything. He was finishing the job. They left the dock exactly the way they'd found it, compromised, quiet, and ready to fail on cue. I saved the footage. Then I backed it up. Then I backed it up again. Standing there in the dark, listening to the lake breathe against the posts, I understood something that made my hands shake. They weren't trying to prove the dock was unsafe. They were trying to make it unsafe. And now, they'd done it on camera. I didn't sleep much after that night, not because I was scared, but because something had snapped into focus. Once you watch someone sabotage your property on purpose, you stop wondering if it's a misunderstanding. You start asking how far they're willing to go. The next afternoon, while I stood near the shoreline pretending to check a loose cleat, an old pickup rolled up behind me. The engine ticked as it cooled. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Harold Boone had lived by Willow Bend Lake longer than almost anyone still around. He moved slow now, joints stiff from decades of farm work, but his eyes were sharp. He stood beside me for a moment, looking out over the water like he was measuring something invisible. "You know," he said quietly, "that lake never belonged to them." I didn't answer. I let the silence do its work. Harold leaned against his truck and started talking, not like someone gossiping, but like someone setting the record straight. He told me about the flood years ago, the one that tore through the valley before the developments arrived. He talked about how the county crews were stretched thin, how locals stepped in because they had to. About my grandfather showing up with tools and plans when nobody else did, and my father taking over later without ever asking for credit. "They act like they built it," Harold said, shaking his head. "But they showed up late. Loud. That's all." That sentence stayed with me. The next morning, I drove into town and walked into the county records office. The building smelled like dust and old paper, the kind of place where time moved slower on purpose. Behind the counter sat Evelyn Torres, glasses low on her nose, flipping through a ledger like she'd done it 1,000 times already. I explained why I was there without drama. I mentioned the lake. I mentioned my family name. Her hands paused. "Give me a minute," she said. She disappeared into the back and returned with a rolling cart stacked with boxes and bound files that looked older than the building itself. The pages crackled softly as she opened them, stamped and handwritten. The ink faded but careful. "There," she said, pointing. The agreement was dated 1923. It laid everything out in plain language. The construction and long-term maintenance of Willow Bend Lake's water system. The inlet gates, the spillway, the shoreline structures. In exchange for labor, funding, and ongoing oversight, the county granted stewardship to my grandfather. Not ownership in name, but authority in function. Evelyn kept reading. The rights transferred automatically to direct descendants, provided the county was notified. My father had done that years earlier, quietly and legally. When he passed, the stewardship transferred again, to me. I felt the room go still as it sank in. These documents didn't just protect my dock. They covered the entire lake system, any adjustment to water levels, any structure touching the shoreline, any group claiming authority over the lake had to receive written approval from the steward. Then Evelyn pulled out something else and slid it across the counter. A plat map. She tapped it with her pen. "This part usually gets ignored," she said. "Cedar Ridge Estates doesn't even reach the shoreline." I leaned closer. The boundary line stopped short, a clean margin of land between the HOA and the water. "They're trying to govern land they don't own," she continued. "Their boundary ends about 20 feet from the lake. Everything past that, the shore, the dock, the water system, was never part of the HOA at all." She looked up at me. "They weren't stretching authority. They were pretending it existed." That was when it fully clicked. The HOA thought they owned the room. My family owned the floor they were standing on. Evelyn printed certified copies and stamped them carefully, the seal hitting the page with a dull thump that felt heavier than it sounded. "People forget," she said softly. "Paper doesn't." I walked out with those documents sitting on the passenger seat like something alive. I could have ended it right there. One meeting, one letter, one call to the county. But I didn't, because now I understood something just as important as the law. People who believe they have power don't stop until they're forced to, and the fastest way to expose them isn't to interrupt, is to let them keep going while everything is recorded. So I stayed quiet. I repaired the damaged joint on the dock carefully, documenting every step. I answered HOA notices politely, never revealing what I knew. I let Marilyn keep sending letters. I let Derek keep measuring. I let the threats pile up. Because when someone is drunk on authority, the moment they overreach is inevitable. And I wanted that moment to be undeniable. I didn't take those documents back to the HOA. I took them to someone who understood exactly what kind of trouble they represented if handled the wrong way. That's how I ended up sitting across from Ruth Lauren Whitaker, her office quiet except for the soft whir of a ceiling fan and the faint scrape of paper as she turned each page. She didn't rush. She didn't skim. She read like someone diffusing something delicate. I watched her eyes move back and forth, tracing dates, signatures, transfers. When she reached the plat map, she stopped completely and leaned back in her chair. "They don't have authority," she said, not loudly, not triumphantly, just plainly. "Not over your dock, not over the shoreline, not over the water." She explained it in terms that were impossible to misunderstand. The HOA's power ended at the boundary lines of its development and its members. That was it. It didn't matter how many rules they printed or how official their letters sounded. They could not regulate land they didn't own, and they certainly couldn't regulate a lake system that was never part of their plat. Then she tapped the stewardship agreement. "This isn't symbolic," she said. "It's functional. Your family didn't just build around the lake, they were entrusted with it." She paused, then added, "The HOA thought they owned the room. Your family owns the floor they're standing on." Her tone shifted after that. "If they interfere with the lake system itself," she said, "that's no longer an HOA dispute. That's environmental exposure, public safety, criminal liability." That was the sentence that stayed with me. Because while I was learning exactly how wrong Marilyn was, she was still moving forward like she couldn't lose. 2 days later, the email hit every inbox in Cedar Ridge Estates. The subject line was written in all caps, urgent enough to make people open it immediately. An emergency HOA meeting had been scheduled. The message talked about critical safety concerns and necessary inspections. It was framed as responsibility, protection, leadership. Then I saw the line that made my hands go cold. The HOA intended to lower part of the lake for inspection purposes. They didn't ask permission. They didn't notify the county. They didn't mention the steward. They just declared it. Lowering the lake wasn't some harmless test. It changed pressure along the shoreline. It affected docks, boats, wildlife, and downstream flow. Done wrong, it could destabilize structures that had been underwater for decades. It wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. And suddenly, everything else made sense. Marilyn wasn't lowering the lake to inspect it. She was lowering it to expose the damage. The joists Derek had weakened the night before sat just below the normal waterline. Drop the level a few inches, and suddenly, the unsafe supports would be visible to inspectors. The emergency wouldn't be created during the inspection. It would be revealed. I forwarded the email to Lauren. Her reply came back almost immediately. "They cannot do that. If they try, document everything." That was it. No long explanation. No panic. Just instruction. That evening, I walked down to the dock as the sun slid behind the trees. The water was calm, reflecting orange and gold, completely indifferent to the argument happening above it. I thought about my father checking the inlet gates after storms, how careful he'd been, how every adjustment was measured because he understood what was at stake. Marilyn Keene wasn't bluffing anymore. She was willing to risk everyone around her just to prove she was in charge. That's when preparation stopped being optional. I printed the HOA email and filed it with the others. I photographed the inlet gate and spillway from multiple angles, noting their exact positions. I started logging water levels again, writing down times and conditions the same way my father used to. I checked the cameras twice a day and made sure backups were current. I didn't change anything. I didn't interfere. I just watched. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the end of the week. Marilyn framed it as transparency, but the tone was pure threat. Comply, or the HOA would act in the best interest of the community. I knew exactly what that meant. That night, I stood on the dock longer than usual, listening to the steady slap of water against the posts. The air smelled like wet cedar and lake grass. Everything felt balanced, stable, the way it was supposed to be. I wasn't going to stop them with shouting. I wasn't going to reveal my hand too early. I was going to let them try to overreach one more time. Because once someone shows they're willing to endanger everyone just to win an argument, the only responsible move is to make sure they're caught doing it. And when that moment came, there wouldn't be any room left for doubt. The parking lot was already overflowing when I pulled in. Cars lined the grass and spilled onto the shoulder of the road, headlights still on as people hurried toward the community hall. Inside, every chair was filled. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, arms crossed, voices low. The air felt tight, like everyone sensed this meeting wasn't going to end the way the flyer promised. Marilyn Keene stood at the front of the room like she was on a stage. A projector hummed behind her, throwing images onto the wall. The first slide was my dock, photographed from angles chosen to make straight boards look warped and uneven. She clicked to the next slide. Red arrows, bold text, words like liability, collapse risk, and property value impact stamped across the screen. She paced slowly as she talked, letting each phrase hang long enough to sink in. She reminded everyone that the HOA existed to protect them. That leadership meant making hard choices. That safety sometimes required enforcement. Every sentence was rehearsed, sharp, and confident. Then she turned toward me. She announced that the board would vote to seize my dock and levy substantial fines for continued non-compliance. If necessary, she said, further action would be taken to establish full HOA control over the shoreline. She said it like a conclusion, not a proposal. I stayed seated. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I let her finish. When Marilyn finally asked if there were any comments, I stood and walked to the front. The room quieted immediately. I placed a small stack of papers on the podium, setting them down carefully so the county seals were visible even from the first row. Certified copies. Heavy paper. Real weight. I told everyone I understood their concerns. I said I'd listen carefully. Then I explained calmly that the HOA didn't have the authority it claimed, that it never had. That the lake, the shoreline, and my dock fell under legally recorded stewardship that predated the HOA by decades. Murmurs rippled through the room. Marilyn didn't even look down. She reached forward, grabbed the stack of documents, and tossed them back toward me without reading a single page. The papers slid across the podium and scattered. "These are irrelevant," she snapped. "They don't apply to a modern association." The sound of the papers hitting the floor cut through the room. A few people flinched. Others stared. That's when the doors at the back opened. Attorney Lauren Whitaker walked in first, composed and unmistakably official. Behind her came Sheriff Nolan Pierce, hat tucked under his arm, eyes scanning the room with a calm that didn't need to raise its voice. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air had been pulled tight. Lauren introduced herself and addressed the board directly. She confirmed that the documents Marilyn had just thrown aside were valid, enforceable, and still binding. She explained that I held stewardship authority over the entire lake system, water levels, shoreline structures, inlet gates, and access points. Any attempt by the HOA to regulate or interfere without my approval was unauthorized. Sheriff Pierce stepped forward next. He confirmed the county had reviewed the documentation and recognized its legitimacy. He added, plainly, that altering lake levels or tampering with shoreline structures without proper authority could carry serious legal consequences. I watched the board members' faces change in real time. One leaned toward another and whispered urgently. A third stared down at the table like it might offer answers. Confidence drained out of the room, replaced by something closer to panic. Marilyn raised her voice, sharp and brittle. She accused me of intimidation, of bringing in outsiders to bully the board. She insisted the HOA had acted in good faith and that this was all being exaggerated. That's when I spoke again. I told the room about the damage to the dock. I described the fresh split near the ladder joint. Then I told them about the cameras, about the footage. Clear, time-stamped video of Derek Sloan on my dock after midnight, using a pry bar to widen the joint he later called unsafe. I said the footage had audio. I said it had backups. The sheriff's posture shifted instantly. Marilyn froze. Lauren added that the footage would be turned over to county investigators if necessary. She reminded the board that manufacturing evidence or creating a false emergency wasn't an HOA issue, it was a legal one. Derek, seated near the wall, stood up before anyone asked him to. His face had gone pale. His voice shook as he spoke too fast. "I was told it was approved," he said, pointing toward Marilyn. "She told me to document it. She said the county paperwork didn't matter." The room erupted. Questions flew. Accusations followed. Someone demanded to know how long the HOA had been operating like this. Another asked what else had been manipulated. The vote Marilyn had promised was never called. Instead, a board member asked for an immediate pause. Another asked whether the association needed independent legal counsel. Someone else asked quietly what would happen if the HOA had already crossed a line it couldn't step back from. Marilyn stood there, hands clenched, watching the control she'd built crumble in front of everyone. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened anyone. I had simply brought truth into a room that had been running on fear. And as I looked around, it was clear everyone finally understood the same thing. They weren't standing on ground the HOA owned. The meeting didn't end with a decision, but it ended with something far more dangerous for Marilyn Keene doubt. People poured out of the community hall in tight clusters, voices low, replaying every word they'd just heard. Marilyn didn't linger. She slipped out a side door, heels sharp against the tile, shoulders stiff like she could still force control back into place if she moved fast enough. She didn't realize she'd already crossed the line. I knew it the next morning. I stepped onto the dock just before sunrise, coffee in hand out of habit, and felt it immediately. The lake was wrong. The waterline sat lower against the posts, exposing a dark, wet band of wood that shouldn't have been there. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just enough to matter. Anyone else might have shrugged it off. I didn't. I opened the camera feed covering the inlet gate. The footage rolled back to before dawn. Derek Sloan was there, shoulders hunched, breath fogging the air as he worked the crank. Metal groaned softly as the gate shifted. Two other figures stood nearby, one holding a phone, the other pacing. Then the audio cut through clearly. Derek hesitated. You could hear it in his voice when he said this wasn't necessary, that the level was fine. The response came back sharp and impatient. Lower it, Marilyn said. The inspectors need to see the supports. That was the trap. She wasn't lowering the lake for inspection. She was lowering it to expose the damage. The joists Derek had weakened the night before sat just below the normal waterline. Drop the lake a few inches, and suddenly, the unsafe structure would be visible. The emergency wouldn't be created during the inspection. It would be revealed. The gate turned again. The water dropped, and Marilyn sealed her own case. I made one call. By mid-morning, county trucks rolled up near the inlet. Engineers stepped out carrying clipboards and equipment, boots crunching against gravel as they assessed the gate position and compared it to recorded levels. Sheriff Nolan Pierce arrived shortly after, followed by another patrol vehicle. Neighbors gathered along the road, confusion turning into concern as they noticed boats tilting slightly and shoreline mud exposed where it hadn't been the day before. The engineers didn't need long. They checked the gate settings, reviewed the footage, and shook their heads. This wasn't maintenance. It wasn't an inspection. It was an unauthorized adjustment to regulated infrastructure. The sheriff watched the footage on my phone in silence. When Marilyn's voice came through the speaker clear, sharp, unmistakable, he paused the video and looked up. Who ordered the gate change, he asked. An emergency follow-up meeting was called that afternoon. This time, Marilyn wasn't running it. The room filled faster than the night before, but the energy had shifted. There were no charts, no slides, no rehearsed talking points, just residents standing, arms crossed, waiting for answers. Sheriff Pierce addressed the room first. He explained what had been found, what laws had been violated, and what was now under investigation. He stated plainly that the HOA had no authority over the lake system and that any further interference would result in immediate legal action. Then the footage played. You could feel the room change as Derek appeared on the screen, turning the gate crank. When Marilyn's voice followed, ordering him to lower the water so the damage would be visible, heads snapped toward her all at once. Before anyone could speak, Derek stood up. His face was pale. His voice shook. The confidence he'd carried on the dock was gone. She told me to do it, he said, pointing straight at Marilyn. She said it was for property values. She said the county paperwork didn't matter. Marilyn finally spoke. I did it for the property values, she snapped, voice rising. Someone had to take charge. The words hit the room like a drop plate. She'd meant it as justification. It landed like a confession. People started shouting at once. Accusations flew. Someone demanded to know how long the HOA had been charging illegal fees. Another asked what else had been manipulated. The board members looked at each other, realizing all at once how exposed they were. The board chair stood, hands trembling slightly, and read from the bylaws. Given the evidence presented and the immediate legal exposure, Marilyn Keene was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The room erupted. Not cheers, not applause, something heavier. Anger mixed with relief. People stood, pointing, demanding audits, refunds, accountability. Marilyn tried to speak again, but no one was listening anymore. The title she'd relied on meant nothing without belief behind it. She walked out without looking back. Outside, county engineers reset the inlet gate under supervision. The lake began to stabilize, water creeping back toward its familiar line. Marilyn hadn't lost because she was outmatched. She lost because she tried to manufacture authority she never had, and did it on camera. And once everyone saw that, the illusion collapsed all at once. The county didn't waste time. 2 days after Marilyn was removed, an official notice arrived, hand-delivered and stamped so heavily it felt final, just holding it. It was a formal cease and desist addressed to Cedar Ridge Estates HOA, and it didn't hedge or soften its language. The association was ordered to immediately stop enforcing any rules related to the lake, the shoreline, docks, water access, or water levels. Every regulation they had issued was declared void. They had never had the authority they claimed. The fallout moved faster than I expected. The county ordered a review of all fees the HOA had collected under the banner of lake maintenance or water oversight. It didn't take long for the numbers to surface. Years of charges, thousands of dollars taken from residents who assumed the HOA had the right to collect them. Letters went out explaining the situation, and refunds followed. Checks started appearing in mailboxes up and down the neighborhood. People compared amounts at their kitchen tables, shaking their heads, realizing how long they'd been paying simply because no one had ever challenged the story. Derek Sloan's situation collapsed just as quickly. The footage, paired with the engineer's reports, triggered an immediate investigation into his contractor license. Tampering with regulated infrastructure wasn't something that could be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. His license was suspended, pending review, and word traveled fast. Developers stopped calling. HOAs stopped returning messages. The same reputation that had made him the preferred contractor turned toxic overnight. The silence that followed him was loud. Around the lake, the tone shifted completely. The flyers vanished first. No one claimed responsibility for them. The emails stopped soon after. Marilyn's name, once spoken with confidence and certainty, became something people avoided altogether. She didn't show up at meetings. She didn't walk the shoreline. The authority she'd tried to manufacture disappeared so completely that it was hard to remember how dominant it had once felt. Neighbors began approaching me quietly at first. A couple stopped by with a plate of cookies and an apology they'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over. Another admitted they'd forwarded the HOA emails without reading them carefully. Someone else said they believed the warnings because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. No one tried to justify it. They just wanted to say they were wrong. Fear had fueled the smear campaign. Once the fear was gone, there was nothing left to sustain it. I spent the next weekend on the dock, not because it was unsafe, but because I wanted it whole again. I sanded the boards where the pry bar had scarred them, resealed the joints, and tightened every bolt by hand. The smell of cedar hung in the air, sharp and clean. Neighbors walked by and waved again. A few stopped to watch. Kids asked if they could fish like they used to. I told them yes. The lake settled back into itself. The waterline returned to its familiar mark. Boats floated evenly again instead of leaning awkwardly toward shore. Wildlife crept back to the edges within days, unbothered by the human drama that had finally burned itself out. The water moved the way it always had, steady and patient. The county followed up with a final confirmation letter recognizing the stewardship authority under my name, officially recorded and sealed. It wasn't framed as a victory, it was framed as continuity. An acknowledgement that responsibility had existed all along, whether anyone had respected it or not. I didn't install new signs. I didn't restrict access. I didn't change how the lake was treated. Because it had never needed control. It needed respect. The dock stayed. The lake stayed calm. And as the days passed without new warnings, new emails, or new threats, something else stayed too, a sense of quiet that hadn't been there in a long time. The next morning, I went back out onto the dock as the sun crept over the trees. The boards were cool under my feet, still carrying the faint scent of cedar where I'd repaired the damage they tried to leave behind. I tightened the last bolt by hand and listened as the wood settled, solid and quiet, the way it was always meant to be. The lake was calm again, not controlled, not threatened, just respected. I sat at the edge of the dock with my coffee and watched the light spread across the water. No warning notices. No emergency emails. No footsteps behind me demanding compliance. Just the slow lap of water against the posts and the sound of birds waking up along the shoreline. That's when the lesson finally felt complete. Authority isn't claimed, it's proven. Marilyn Keene believed power came from a title, from standing behind a podium and speaking loudly enough that people stopped questioning her. She forgot that real power leaves a paper trail. It lives in records, boundaries, and responsibility pass quietly from one set of hands to the next, long before anyone tries to rewrite the rules. The sun climbed higher, warming the dock beneath me. The lake stayed steady, and for the first time since this all began, the silence didn't feel tense or temporary. It felt earned. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?